One of the greatest singers of the 20th century was none other than this particular lady. She had a voice that truly was magnificent, and of course through many of those songs has really lasted into the 21st century. We're talking of course about the supremely talented Karen Carpenter, and today I wanted to share a couple of memories of Karen with you. Hi, good morning, Neil Sean here in the heart of London. Hope you're keeping well. And yes, we're talking about the wonderful voice of Karen Carpenter. Now, let me just explain. Karen Carpenter to me was one of those characters that, she was really talented. I remember buying the album when I was very young with the Carpenters live at the London Palladium. It was one of those albums that you could buy in a budget rack, do you remember? And I didn't realise that Karen initially started out as a drummer. So not only did she possess that wonderful angelic-like voice, but also was an accomplished musician too. Let's not forget, of course, her brother, Richard, who is a brilliant musician in his own right. I've been lucky enough to meet Richard Carpenter, and, he's a rather complex man because, of course, he's living naturally in the shadow of his sister. It's very difficult, of course, if you're a duo and sadly one leaves you, because then you have the problem, of course, of everybody asking you about that. But it was my association with the super producer, Phil Ramone, that really started this memory, because I was looking at some older footage, and you know what it's like when you go through that, you think, wow, Phil Ramone, he was a brilliant guy. Now, for those that don't know, Phil Ramone, of course, was a brilliant musician himself, incredible musician. Started out as a jobbing sort of, act, if you like, and then went on to produce so many great names. Paul Simon, Barbra Streisand, you name it. He literally made hits for so many people. But listening to that tape back, it was interesting to note that there was one project that really upset him. And this really all centers on the very last project of Karen Carpenter as a solo star. Way back in 1979, Phil Ramone and Karen Carpenter got together because they wanted to make her first solo album for A&M Records, which at that time was owned by Herb Alpert. Do you remember him? The man with the trumpet? Oh yes, brilliant star. Now, interesting, of course, for Phil and Karen, because they were looking at the disco era. They wanted to reinvent Karen's sound, not really into the Donna Summer disco sexiness of Studio 54 and things like that, but basically to make her come up to date, perhaps not so many saccharine sweet ballads about doom and gloom, although I do like Rainy Days and Mondays. But for Karen herself, they recorded over 18 tracks together, and then just as it was completed, she sought, of course, guidance and wisdom from her brother, Richard, and of course the record label, and they decided that they didn't want to launch the album. They didn't think it was right for the market. Of course, Phil Ramone told me that he thought this was totally wrong, not because he produced it, but because he felt that Karen's audience had grown up and they would accept her now being a slightly more mature vocalist singing slightly, shall we say, racier songs. When you listen to the album now, which was released finally in its element, not all of it though, in 1996, you can see a maturity in her sound, her voice and her attitude. It would have become a huge success. And Phil said to me that that was one of his major, greatest regrets as a musician and producer, because he felt it really was some of his very best work. And he spoke to Karen simply on the day before she died, and she too was very sad that the album now wasn't going to be coming out. In this era, of course, it could have been streamed and tested and done all sorts of different things. But when people put out albums way back when, it cost a lot of money, There was marketing, designing, printing, all of that sort of stuff. Sadly for Karen, she lived in the wrong digital era. But Phil said that she was very happy with it and was very sad that her record label, A&M, decided not to put it forward. And he concluded in this interview, which were recorded way back, I think in around 2011, that basically he said she would be thrilled to know that people are still enjoying her voice today. And more importantly, that they've now finally discovered her disco album. For me, as I say, I was never lucky enough to meet Karen Carpenter. I did see her actually live. She came onto a TV show over here in the United Kingdom, which starred Bruce Forsyth. Don't know if you remember him, a super guy that was the host of Sunday night at the London Palladium over here, and he had a few specials and he invited her on to perform. She looked painfully thin, rather ill, but of course gave it her all as a true trooper that she was. It's lovely, as I say, to share some of these memories of some of the icons that you've been lucky enough to brush with or indeed find out more detail about. And as ever, do let me know what your memories and thoughts are about this once wonderful and still remaining brilliant singer. Isn't it nice we can still remember them, thankfully, through the power of radio, audio, streaming, and all sorts of ways of listening to the voice of Karen Carpenter. Neil Sean in the heart of London.